Excellent one and all. Well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon to the next SYNAPSE seminar by Simon Coxe. Before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land which we meet physically, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay respects to past and present leaders and emerging as well. So before I introduce Simon Coxe, just a couple of pointers. It's online and in person, so we're going to run through the seminar and have plenty of time afterwards for a bit of Q&A. And the idea of these SYNAPSE seminars is to be as interdisciplinary as possible, so bringing in a wide range of speakers across a range of different topics that connect in many ways with all the disciplines that we as archaeologists and linguists and geneticists and anthropologists work on, to kind of draw out and tease out some of the ways in which we can sort of help each other answer those questions. So it's about creating dialogue and sharing all the wonderful things that is happening here at the ECD, the Evolution of Cultural Diversity Initiative at ANU, but also around Australia, around the world, in the Pacific region. So by way of introduction, today we have Simon Coxe. Simon is a PhD student at Monash University, and he's working on skeletal remains from the southern Massim region in southeast Papua New Guinea. Simon is an archaeologist from the UK and has been in Australia now since 2009. He came across it as a consultant, but very quickly moved into Papua New Guinea archaeology. I think you're only in Australia for a few short months before
very short period of time.
Before you started working on the Caution Bay archaeological project up in just out of Port Moresby, working with the Motu and Koita people up there for several months. And since that time has been working in different parts of New Guinea. I've had the pleasure of working with Simon for many a year now, since 2009 actually, on that project is where we both met. And we've worked extremely well together since that time. And the questions that we've been trying to approach, we complement each other very well in the way that we think, and the project that you've got is really born out of the passion that you have for understanding the way in which communities identify and individuals identify themselves in the communities that we're working. And the project that Simon is doing is looking at skeletal remains of individuals that have been buried on an island called Panaeati in the southern Massim, and trying to unravel some of the nuances of what that might mean in terms of how that person or people are perceived by the people that buried them, and how that continues through, not only through their life, but after they have passed away and lived on with the communities that they're part of. And so Simon has done a phenomenal job of getting this project up and running. As you can imagine, dealing with skeletal remains in any context is hugely sensitive and must be done with a great deal of empathy. And I really can't think of a better person to do this project. Simon, since working in New Guinea for all these years, has demonstrated exactly that, has developed excellent community relations because of his honesty, because of his passion and his enthusiasm, and the time that he takes to just sit down and talk to communities about what they want to learn about the cultural material and their own past. So it's a great pleasure that I'm able to help Simon with this project in a very small way. And I'm very excited to hear what you've got to present today. So I will turn it over to you, and you can just, get rid of that.
Okay.
Don't mute me today.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Excellent.
Welcome to the 21st century, Simon.
So I will hand it over now to Simon to kick off the presentation. But as I said, at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat, or just raise your hand, and at the end we'll sort of have a bit of a discussion between those here in the room and those that are online. So thank you very much, Simon.
Lovely. Well, okay. Well, first off, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to sit here and be entertained and perhaps even educated. I'm still in the process myself. So look, I've got my little script here just in case I go a little bit off key and need to pull myself back on, a bit flustered. So, but really, so what I want to do is just walk you through what I've been doing for my PhD research. So there it is. That's the research question as it is. So how does the skeletal body contribute to the making of indigenous personhood in the southern Massim? So specifically, I've been looking at secondary burials in caves and niches in New Guinea. And what I've also been doing is applying anthropological models of personhood and the ethnographies from the region to try and understand how skeletal remains and concepts of personhood were understood by people in the past. And this research can be pretty much applied for the last 1,000 years in the region. Just for those of you who don't know, secondary burials, they're basically where the bones of a person have been removed from a primary burial, which could be something like burying people in the ground or exposure or something like that. And then they're taken somewhere else, buried, used somewhere else. So that's basically what we're talking about. So I'll just be guiding you through as best I can. And before we move on, beautiful picture, any excuse to go out there and take photos of the wonderful landscapes and seascapes, but just hold this in mind. I'm going to come back to the end of this and think about what you see. Ben's already done an acknowledgement of the country, but I would also like to acknowledge traditional owners of the country that we live and work on, past, present, and emerging elders. And I also recognise that sovereignty of these lands has never been ceded and can never be extinguished. And also on that note, I would like to be absolutely clear, this presentation shows images of human remains, also images of people who have passed on actually very recently. The outline of the presentation comes in 4 parts, 4 easy to swallow parts. So first I'll run you through basically what the problem, what are the aims of my research in the region. Then I'll give you a bit of a Coxe tour through personhood, very complicated, but hopefully I can do it some service. And then I'll give you an overview of burial practices in the Massim, both from an ethnographic point of view and also from an archaeological point of view. And then I'll give you some of the highlights from my fieldwork that I did last year. And hopefully we'll tie it all up with a nice neat bow. Okay then, so now the Massim region. So let's just talk a little bit about the Massim. It is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. I mean, hugely complicated in terms of its geology. As a lot of the islands on the western part of the Louisiana archipelago and the northern Massim, they're limestone. You go further east, it's like metavolcanics, volcanics. Massim has got gold mining on it. Woodlark, I think, had gold mining, so really diverse in just in terms of the physical landscape. The cultural landscape is just as diverse and complicated. Over 48 languages spoken there. I'm sure many of the linguists in the audience are probably very aware of all the wonderful things that are being done out there with the research. Also, just in terms of the depth of time that human beings have been out there as well. Well, we know that people have been in the region since at least 17,000 years. Now that's due to some of the excavations I had the pleasure and privilege of working with the communities with, alongside Ben at Kelabonagum on Panaeati, which is just here. And so that doesn't really come as a surprise when we also know that there's human occupation in the Bismarck archipelago going back 40,000 years. So there's every real chance that humans have been in the southern Massim, the Massim generally, well before 17,000 years ago. We also have evidence of the Pita people in the region. So until, again, fairly recently, there was a bit of a question mark over this part of New Guinea as to whether they were there present. And lo and behold, again, excavations have been conducted with the community on Brooker Island, which is a tiny little speck just down here. Again, alongside Ben, we proved that the Pita people were on that island, and also it's probably no stretch of the imagination to expect to find them on other islands of the region. So about 2,800, 2,700 years ago. And we've also got, I think, forward a very good case to suggest they were interacting with indigenous people in the region as well. Coming forward a little bit more in time, we have the cooler trade, probably very famous. I'm sure a lot of you know about it. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but really in terms of what we know, it started maybe about 500 years ago, 200 years ago, certainly in its current form. But people have probably been trading on the islands for many hundreds, if not thousands of years before then. So that's basically the Massim as it is as a physical entity in terms of what we know about it intellectually. So one thing that is worth noting about the term the Massim is it's basically an anthropological ethnographic invention, first coined by an Italian friar whose name eludes me at the moment, but it was Alfred Court Haddon who basically decided that this was a useful term to try and characterize a series of cultural complexes across a broad region. So just a nice little term to basically encapsulate those traditions. And one of those traditions that linked the areas to the north and the south was burial practices, specifically secondary burial practices. In terms of the archaeological problem, where I'm stepping in, hopefully to illuminate some of those darker corners, very little focus has actually been given to the archaeological study of in situ burials in the southern Massim. We've got some stuff that was done by Simon Bickler and Goran Burenholtz in the northern Massim, but really in the south, there's really not that much. I mean, so Ben has looked at some stuff, and then we've got some burials that were recorded on Tuve, but really not much. And also very little focus has actually been given over to applications of models of personhood to the archaeological evidence in the Massim. Now, the interesting thing is that most of the models of personhood that have been applied to archaeological contexts in North America, Northwestern Europe, they've all basically come from a lot of these strong models from Melanesian personhood, which I'll talk about in a bit, but they've never really actually been applied to the region where they came from, as it were. So that's what I'm looking to do there, is fill that gap there. So, I mean, in terms of mortuary archaeology or mortuary rites in general, they're really good for giving us an insight into a lot of those really complex social networks. And in particular, they're really good for giving us insight into ideas of personhood. And archaeology is perfectly placed to allow us to make those connections with material culture. Burial practices in person in the past, one of the ways that we can apply archaeology to the problem. Okay. So one of the aims of the project, really, so the big overarching question is, how was personhood materially conveyed through secondary burials? Which is quite a broad question in itself. So I've tried to break it down to a series of smaller questions, such as, what do they actually look like? So are they in caves? Are they in niches, sinkholes, etc., etc., etc.? How is the skeletal body actually represented? So are people selecting skulls, as in this image here, or are they selecting long bones? Basically, what's present? What are people selecting? What are they choosing to put in these places? And also, what material culture is present? So things like pots, stone tools, and so on and so on. So, and obviously, how well does the archaeology actually correlate with the ethnographic record which we have out there, which is remarkably rich. Okay, so what is personhood? Again, quite a broad and complicated topic in itself. So again, I'll try and do it justice, but at the same time, not overwhelm you or myself. Really, in a nutshell, it is how a person identifies or is identified within the network of social relationships. In other words, it's the cumulative effect of a person's ongoing relationships in life. So aspects of identity, such as age, gender, sex, ancestry, marital status, social status, so on, so on, so on. They all play a crucial part in the formation of personhood, its development. And personhood isn't a given thing from birth. It's an ongoing process. So other things like clothing, decoration, they all help sort of like convey a person's sort of like status or aspects of their identity, basically their personhood through objects, if you will. So maybe you can think of the hat or the crown that a king or pope wears at investiture. They've gone through a stage or a state, or graduation, people wearing silly hats. So again, so these things mark a person's progress through life and the development of their person. So, I mean, if we think about, for example, Ben in Australia, he's a partner, he's a professor, you know, he's a son, all these various different aspects of who he is, where he comes from, his ancestry, Scottish ancestry, I believe. So whether he charts that through DNA or a family tree, even the way he speaks, actually, his Kiwi accent defines him as somebody from Australia. So for better or for worse, but they all help to communicate aspects of his persona. Now, if we were to move into an alternative world where Ben grew up in Papua New Guinea, there'd be different aspects of his character, again, maybe as a father, as a son, all his familiar obligations, sort of like, you know, his ancestry, his connections to land and how that's come to him, the things that you might do. I mean, how good is Ben at rearing pigs, making canoes, ceremonial dancing? I think we all know the answer to that. In any university, it's going to be bad. But again, so those things, they play out in a different way. So, and the objects that Ben might choose to use to convey that in Papua New Guinea, how he keeps those objects, who he gives them away to, they're all going to play a part in that ongoing project of being Ben Shaw. Okay, so let's just talk about, there's two broad notions of person that we can think about, and they're not mutually exclusive. In the first instance, we've got, maybe you call it the orthodox idea of person, so the Western notion of personhood, which is to say, as we understand it, like the person is an inalienable, fixed entity for the duration of the person's life. So, familiar term, as we will call ourselves, individuals. Okay. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have relational personhood, which is that persons are comprised of other persons. So parts of one person can be shared, passed on to another person. So it's very dynamic. The other thing to remember is that humans are but one kind of person. So animals, plants, spirits, objects, and even landscapes, they can all be conceived as having personhood. A good recent example, I guess, is the Waikato River in New Zealand that was just recently given status as a person. So I think the important thing to note here is that that network of persons can be quite varied. And in some instances, even certain plants or certain animals, they're actually kind of understood on an ontological level as being human. So even though you might look at something like a yam or a pig, there's certain qualities about that which are inherently human. How would we define that? Okay, so anthropology has done a huge job of describing all the various different ways a person can be a person. And in particular, we have this notion of Melanesian personhood, which is quite a broad overarching term that describes a whole range of different indigenous ideas of what it means to be a person. So the likes of Marilyn Strathern, Deborah Battaglia, Annette Weiner, Martha McIntyre, all of these amazing people who have written quite extensively about it. But I think in particular, Marilyn Strathern, amongst those, she's done quite a bit of work in the Highlands, and she's shown that persons there are dynamic. So the relationships between people there in particular they are, you know, as it says here, the singular person can be imagined as a social microcosm. And one of the ways that personhood is mediated is through objects. So, and objects given through exchanges, so things like pigs, axes, shell valuables, often through elaborate ceremonies, feasts. That is effectively giving a part of yourself. And so objects in this instance are very, very important for conveying that. So the coolering in particular, I think, is one of the best examples, particularly given my area of research, in terms of how these objects actually mediate relational personhood. So it is, as it says here, it's one of the best examples of a reciprocal gift economy. So in a nutshell, again, it's hugely complicated and people have been debating this since Bronislawski actually documented it. So objects like this is Mwali, the shell armband, that is traded, that is, forgive me for not getting this right, counterclockwise, I do believe, yes. And then you have on the right, these are Sulavi, or as they're known in the Massim region, Bargi. I'm wearing one right now. And so these objects are traded over long distances by canoe between trade partners. So trading partners, these relationships can last years. And so one of the things about these objects is that a part of the person goes with them. And so effectively, when we're talking about cooler chain exchange, it's as much about moving parts of a person around as it is these valuables. So, okay, there we go. So yeah, they're important in the production and maintenance of relational personhood. So I think by way of an example, when we look at axes, for example, which are still hugely important in the Southern Massim, they allow us to have an understanding of that relationship between a person, relational persons, and objects. So these are still traded to this day, more particularly the axe blades, and they're used in bride prices for paying for canoes and so on. And they're hugely important throughout the entire region. But Deborah Battaglia, in particular, she's written beautifully about ideas of personhood on Sarbal, which is it's in the Southern Massim, and it's about halfway between Panaeati and Rossel Island. Now, on Sarbal, axes are bestowed with inanimate status. And so, as we can see from this image here, parts of the axe correspond to the human body. So arm, head, leg, elbow, genitals, right hand, make that connection what you will. But there's also aspects of like referencing male and female, husband and wife. And these are hugely important in terms of the mortuary rites, mortuary feasts. And so what they effectively do is they allow the corpse to be made into an effigy of the social person as an artifact. So okay, so forgive me. So we talk a little bit about what these actually mean. So how are we connecting this axe with ideas of a person? So the axe blade is said to represent like the singular person. So this idea of stored energy, Ganona, that reflects an individual's ability to create or reproduce in life. And so that's the thing that actually configures their lifespan, their lifetime as a creator. Now, the actual body, as it were, of the axe, now this is said to represent corporate identity. So like the clan, the matrilineal descent. And so you have on one hand the singular and on the other hand the corporate. So it's referencing those. So, as Deborah Battaglia says, through objects, the self is defined and experienced through an array of significant relationships with others, past, present, living, and dead. So, if in death, a relational person can be physically and socially deconstructed or constructed using material culture, then how could parts of the dead be used in ongoing relationships by the living in the past? That's what I'm interested in, really. So, in other words, where do the bones go? So, if we turn to the ethnographic evidence, like I said earlier, it's a very rich scene to mine. There's any number of ways which we can get an insight to just what happens to the body. So, inhumation was really just the start of a very long, drawn-out process of mortuary rites, often involving big feasts over several years. And feasting is hugely important to the cultural life cycles in the regions they are throughout most of New Guinea. But prior to Christianity, we know that secondary burials were pretty much the norm. Although there's actually some evidence that suggests they probably carried into the 20th century as well. But for the most part, we're talking about a real sense of wanting to collect the skulls and the long bones. Sometimes they'd be taken and they'd be kept in sort of like the house for long periods of time. Sometimes they'd be used for various different tools and objects of adornment. But eventually, most of them would end up in caves and niches. So, in terms of actually using those tools, this is an example of a lime spatula made from a human fibula. That's from the Marshall Bennett Isles, and that was obviously used for lime chewing. And there's any number of quite sort of like graphic descriptions of people sort of like taking the flesh off bones of their dead father as well. So a very visceral thing, lots of ideas about substance at play there as well. We also know that like human bones could be used to make pins for sailing, fashioning the sailing canoe sails. And we also know that skulls were used to start exchanges with various different people throughout the region. So to initiate a trading partnership. So they were traded obviously for things like bargee and axes and so on and so on. We also know that headhunting, trophies and cannibalism was featured quite heavily in a lot of the early documentation, but we have to have a critical eye on that, because most assumptions were if you see a skull hanging outside of somebody's house, it's evidence of headhunting, when in actual fact it could be the skull of an ancestor or a mother or a father, so a token of affection and remembrance. So it's not always an easy thing to go for, but it definitely did occur predominantly in the south. And we know that like these two examples from Wagga Wagga. So the jawbones were used to decorate the human body as trophies of warrior prowess. And in this instance here, the skulls were adorned around the men's clubhouse. And in fact, the skulls, the heads, I should say, were taken at the investiture of a new clubhouse. So yes, there's a lot of complex things going on there with warfare and headhunting, but not in the way we should be thinking about it. In fact, the idea of warfare and the idea of trading and mortuary feasts, a lot of the ways they play it out, they all use the same language, the same structure. In fact, Martha McIntyre's done some really cool stuff on warfare with the people of Tube, and their headhunting was basically provoked as a means of taking revenge on somebody who killed one of your friends or family members. And the whole reason behind that was to take a victim from the offending group, and they would be ceremonially killed. The body would be portioned up and consumed in ways that were similar to sort of like those mortuary feasts and so on. But really, the main emphasis behind that was to actually allow the person who was being avenged, would allow their spirit to actually reobtain a sense of personhood, so they could move into the next world with that. And the body of the victim was seen as a corporate representation of that group as a whole. So warfare conducted in the region, it's a little bit different. These ideas about warfare for resources and control of land. It's more to do with like these social systems, and I would argue personhood plays a very important part in that role. And just before we move on, this shell here, just take note of that's called wormwold, and I'll be able to show you an example of that a little bit later on. Okay, so time for some hard facts and figures at you. In terms of what we know about the archaeology, so as you can see, the majority of burials that are recorded through the National Museum and Art Gallery, 90% of those in the southern Massim are secondary burials in caves, rock shelters, and so on. Now, that may be due to like just the lack of visibility of inhumations. They're below the ground. Any archaeologist knows without X-ray glasses, you're going to figure out how to see these things. But also there's just the bias in terms of how much field work's been done there. But that does seem to be the overall trend, quite visible in that sense. And obviously, as I alluded to earlier, there is bias in terms of like what's happening in the north, what's happening in the south, again, due to the amount of field work that's been conducted there. So we also know that many burials are associated with ceramics, so pots. And again, most of those have been found in caves and rock shelters and so on. So we can also see here that, that there's a clear sort of like difference in terms of what we know from the north. So a lot of the original cave burials that were recorded by Sir Brian Egloff, he noted that you've got these very distinctive types of pots. In fact, these two here are from Panaeati, so they've definitely moved from the south to the north. So again, we're talking about these levels of connection. In terms of the age on those, they're probably about maybe 400 years old, those two pots. They're about 400 to 800 perhaps. Anyway, so we know we've got pots that are moving around, and also pots were being used, it seems, from Collingwood Bay and from Panaeati specifically for funerary rites. A lot of the local wares for domestic use don't appear to be used as in burial rites. In the south, so things are a little bit sketchy. On Panaeati, Harry Bartlett visited in the 1930s, and he went to a place called Binawaga, and he purloined some pots, and they're actually here. And at the moment, Ben's going to return those to communities when he's finished studying them, so they will go back eventually. So, what else do we got? There we go. So shells. So things like giant clam shells were often used as a way of sort of like holding the bones. But you also have things like baler shells, which are associated with them, and some of the smaller spider shells. So obviously, being like a maritime culture, there's clear connections between the sea and how people may be identifying themselves. We also know that other containers were used, so organic materials, so like basket weaving, which almost certainly would have been used and was described in some of the various different sort of mortuary rites. So wooden bowls, I do believe that I think it was Jeff Irwin, he found wooden bowls on Tube with human remains in them, but also various other people in the north. They found things like, in one instance, like a World War II ammunition box with human remains in it as well. We also know that canoe prows and canoe coffins were a thing. Again, this is something in the north. So Fred Gerritz was, I don't think he was an anthropologist, but he was working, and he was very keen to collect and understand this stuff. Now, he described canoe prows being associated with some of these cave burials. And in some instances, he described them being associated with bone spatulas and bone pins, human bones. But also, in particular, a very unique thing to the region, it seems, was like these little canoe coffins. So things like this, So these were carved obviously to mimic canoes, and both ends they were sort of like carved into the form of snakes' heads, and then various different sort of like bones were placed inside. So very unique in that sense. And given the importance of the role of canoes throughout the region, and you see this all the way along the south coast, actually, all the way through to Torres Strait, this idea of canoes being relational object beings. This connection between sort of like human personhood and like sentient or sort of like objects described with a sense of person in themselves. There's an interesting connection there. Okay, and obviously we have things like adornments. So that mandible I showed earlier, sometimes like the vertebrae, they would be worn by widows as a sign of mourning, and so on. We actually have some evidence from the north. This was excavated by Simon Bickler up on Woodlark, Muyu, and these teeth are probably about, they date to about 920 years ago, and as you can see, they're perforated. So perhaps it's like a necklace or even like a wristband. So people are wearing parts of the dead. So what about inhumations? Well, they are frequently in the north, and again, this is where our best body of evidence comes from. On Woodlark, they were frequently associated with these amazing megalithic structures. About 1,200 years ago, you start to see that, but most of them about 500 to 800 years ago. We also know that on Kirawina, there was a large inhumation cemetery, and again, roughly the same dates. But there does appear to be a shift in terms of the burial practices. So we go from like this association with like these big sort of like corporate group cemeteries to secondary burials again. So around about 500 to 800 years ago, we get this distinctive shift. So this excavation here, this is where that perforated tooth necklace, wristband, whatever it is, came from. And so again, that's associated with one of these megaliths. So we know there's definitely quite a bit of time depth to using human body parts. And so these changes, actually, they do coincide with like a change in pottery decoration. So there's something happening there. Now, Simon Bickler puts forward the idea that it's probably a shift in terms of how social relationships work, and probably develops into what we see today as contemporary burial practices. And he makes the argument it's a shift away from corporate clan identity to more sort of like family-based sense of social connections. And that's an interesting idea just in terms of how you're relating to that. So the corporate or clan-based identity is, we think about those probably people who've beyond living memory for the most part. But if you think about your family members, they're probably people who you could name. So you've got people going to caves in parts, you can probably know who each person was by name. So there's a shift potentially in terms of the depth of time associated with the dead and how you relate to them. And also Simon points out that it's just that there are many more steps involved in waiting for the bones to be ready to be put into a pot, to be put into a cave. So a series of extra complications, if you will, there. Okay, so bone manipulation, trauma, and cannibalism. So coming back to this idea of breaking the body down for a start, getting it to a prepared state, if you will. We do have evidence of things like trepanation and defleshing. So this is from, I think it's Catawba again. So there's two holes there on the top of the skull. So perhaps it's to do with removal of the brain matter. Again, sort of just getting rid of all the icky stuff. Although there is some indication that it was done for medical purposes. There's evidence of some of these holes in the skull which have healed it up. So more unfortunate we had to go through that. We also have evidence of trauma. So this particular poor individual here, this was recorded by Ben on Russell Island, and they came to a somewhat unpleasant end. So you can see there, it didn't take much of the imagination to imagine what a sharp spear can do to somebody's head. So unfortunately, violence and beastliness was definitely a factor there. And we also know, I mean, cannibalism, it's a bit of a difficult thing to talk about, particularly when it comes to the archaeology of it and identifying it. But Ben, again, some of his work on Rossel Island has put forward some very convincing evidence. And so this is actually from a paper that Ben and myself worked on, and tried to angle in some of those aspects of personhood, because really it is about maintenance of social frameworks. It's not just because everybody likes the taste of human flesh. I'm sure some people that's a thing, but really there's very complex mechanisms behind why people are doing this. And so on Rossel Island as well, Ben was saying, as soon as these remains became apparent to his colleagues, the people who was working from the islands, they all looked at it and they recognized it for basically the use of human consumption of humans. So yes, particularly unpleasant thing, talk about, think about, but very real facts. But again, the drives behind it, very complex, very, very, very complex indeed. So this is just an overall schematic. This is my brain on a piece of paper when we're talking about the processes. So again, it's like a step process in terms of how the body's broken down, and just a flow chart in terms of where they might end up. And each of those categories is still a work in progress, but it's all those various different ways that those stages might reflect aspects of somebody's identity and how that feeds into these models of personhood there. So let's get into the really cool stuff, which is, by my own admission, the stuff I was looking at last year. So again, just to run you through it. So look, I actually visited 3 islands, but mostly the work was done on Panaeati. So yeah, 34 locations, 11 sites that I went to in Dessau, and had a really good long look at the bones, what objects were there, and so on. Here we are. Here's some of that. Again, some facts and figures for you. So again, a lot of pottery was recovered. Mostly broken sherds, but some substantially big, and in some instances actual sort of like fully preserved pots. Over 1,000 bones I got my hands on and had a good sort of like measuring with, and then obviously, so based on that, I maybe 166 individuals that I looked at, and that's just a sample of like potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals that have been buried in these caves over time. So who was there? I mean, in terms of like demographics, pretty much everyone, it seems. So from neonate to the elderly, this instance here was actually very touching at the time. So the bones of perinate inside an adult skull. And then we've got various different sort of like ideas of like, you know, maybe, as people would suggest, these are cannibal victims, but the evidence seems to suggest that it's actually pretty much everybody from the community. So young and old, male and female. So yeah, biological sex, and suggest that they're fairly evenly represented. There is some trauma out there, so maybe suggesting that maybe not everybody here has lived a happy, healthy life into old age. And also some interesting things like this. This is probably one of the most extreme examples of pathology. In this instance, what looks like it might be syphilis. There's at least another 2 skulls at this burial location. So, and obviously a little bit of sort of like evidence for defleshing and some of those bone manipulation practices. So quite a broad range of things to get my teeth stuck into. So, and that's where I'm at the moment, is just working out what it all means. So, just to give you an idea of some of the, I call them the flagship sites. Some of the ones I'll just give you here, I think really just ram home just how diverse and complicated some of this stuff is. So this is Papua cave, which is interesting because this is on Panaeati, and Panaeati is Panamissima, Panaeati language. But Papua is, that's from Tuba language, engineer language, one of them. And so that's interesting in a sense when we're not conferring islands as entire sort of like, you know, uniform sort of like groups of people. It seems, given the history of people moving around colonizing, you've got various different people from different parts of the Massim coming and setting up shop on these islands. So my informants told me that Poimole literally means in the shape of a moale shell. So whether that's toponymical for that location, or as may be the case, it seems to be addition there, is people take place names from where they came and give it to a particular place on that island. So again, what that means, I don't know. But so this pot here is probably maybe 200 to 400 years old. Remarkably preserved, absolutely stunning. Based on the dentition, there's 3 individuals in there. You can see how badly eroded the bones are, but the teeth, thankfully, are durable enough to get a good count out of that. So what does that mean? There's 3 people in pots. 3 people have been put in one pot, I should say. So again, we're thinking about these various connections to maybe are they related to each other? What social connections did they have in life that basically meant that they had to be kept together in death? The pot here as well, which is the other end of the spectrum in terms of dates, it's potentially as old as that. We're still trying to work out the chronology of the pots, but this is not from Panaeati. So Vincent Kuribu from UPNG, he found examples of this further to the north on the island of Ilamu, and it's basically bracketing what is potentially very recent burial practices to potentially very old. And if you recall, this shift in burial practices that we see in the north happened around about 800 years ago. If this is slightly older, then that might tell us a little bit more about how these burial practices are changing and shifting and moving, who's influencing who. Another interesting thing about this cave is that there was marine shell scattered all the way through it. So, and in places like this where it was too small, too far away from the light, or even a good place to have a hearth going for it to be purely domestic consumption, as it were. So, in fact, I had to send a small child in to get this pot form. It cost me 5 kina, best 5 kina ever. But so, yeah, of course, there's questions about whether that marine shell is actually even associated with this. It could predate it. These places weren't exclusively used for burials, and actually, same can be said for this early pottery. But it's tantalizing, given the context of these shells and some very isolated Albert 2 places, that it may have connotations of feasting of the dead. If you recall, keep saying that feasting is hugely important for understanding social relationships. So, and then we have Binawaga. So this is the place that Harry Bartlett visited. And this is actually just one of many locations in this amazing sort of like closed depression. Binawaga literally means the place where to work a canoe. And Weda here, he is a master canoe builder. He's hugely respected throughout the community. He's obviously got any ideas about like canoes and their meaning. He thinks that maybe it has something to do with the shape of the depression that these burial sites are located in. So again, whether that's a purposeful association with the dead, with a hugely important cultural object, it's speculation, but I think there's enough things there that you can perhaps sort of like hang some things on it in terms of the ideas. But we also see that it's hugely important just in terms of the level of preservation. Going in these little places here with clearance of maybe no more than 20 to 30 centimeters. Again, where there was in there like a little squirrel pulling things out. But we have, in this instance, obviously like a skull in a pot, beautifully preserved. And again, that's probably about 400 to 800 BP. And then this pot here, and this axe, the axe came out of that pot. So again, so there's like 2 skulls, one almost complete, 2 broken, and then the axe was at the bottom. So again, so what's the connection? What's the meaning of this axe that has been placed with these 2 individuals? And I should also state that all I found in this particular niche was just skulls. A little bit to just where Solomon's standing, it was all predominantly long bones. So there's a separation thing going on But the other interesting thing, sorry, slight digressions, but the greenstone axe itself is interesting because the guys, they say the ancestors travel with the axe. So again, so we're seeing all these ideas and movements of objects, but what's going with it is ideas of what they actually mean in terms of conveying a sense of ancestral identity, ancestral personhood. So again, these objects are clearly important enough that they're there to help show who these people were in life and so forth in death. Again, so Wiley. So this again came from as a location not too far away from that original burial site. So again, so we've got, this is a trade item that's come from the north. It signifies status of an individual. It speaks about this person being a provider. Well, the term they have there is called gia, and that's applicable to both men and women. But it's the ideal understanding of what a person can do in a society. So that's referencing trade. It's referencing this idea of somebody being able to provide in life. We also have like shell spoons, which this has probably come from towards Sud-Est. So again, probably about maybe a couple of days sailing in a canoe. So that's been brought in potentially as a coconut scraper. So again, and we have bargy shell beads. Again, important in terms of like that transfer of shell valuables throughout the region. And of course, if you remember, we have mwamwa, which was hung on that mandible bracelet. Now this, I found these four it was on a little island called Panaeati, Panaeati, and the guys were saying as soon as they saw them, like again, this is evidence of Tonawak, which it means sort of like important man, if you will. But again, we're talking about ideas of a chief, if you will, somebody who could provide the means to actually go off and trade and travel, and perhaps even possibly associated with sort of like warrior prowess, manly attributes, as it were. So that was defined there. So again, so for some reason they've been associated with like these secondary burials, so clearly important enough to associate with these skeletal remains. And of course, I have this is just a selection of some of the perforated teeth. But again, so from the same cave burial on Panaeati, any number of sites in Panaeati seem to keep finding these. So again, is this evidence of warfare, headhunting, or is it evidence of people wearing aspects of the dead, their loved ones? So yes. Okay, so full circle. Is it possible to make a connection between these skeletal remains and person? Well, I believe yes, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here. So from what I've seen, there's definitely these connections to axes and canoes. Again, like these are relational object beings. You've got connections to pottery, possibly like the marine shell for like feasting, but the pottery itself, it speaks of feasting. So again, there's all these ways of like renewing and continuing all these strong social relationships through which people's identity, their sense of kinship, they're all mediated. So all those aspects of personhood seem to be there just in terms of association of parts with these skeletal remains. And then obviously the actual wearing of human body parts. So bringing it back to this original slide, and then this one here as well. So that's the wife of a very angry man who decided he was jealous and cut her in half with an axe. And that's her there on the side of the cliff. That's Panaeati. And this is my friend Lincoln, who is next to a surrogate skull. Now, this is a big rock that came all the way from Massim, not an easy task. And it's literally just on the edge of Panaeati Island. And everybody knows there's a story associated with this, and an ancestral foundation village, which of course, surprise, surprise, there's a burial cave there. And this is, yes, said to be a surrogate skull. So the thing to take away is that people's personhood, all these stories, they're embedded in this world in ways which, if I didn't have the insight of the communities, I would never see them, I would never recognize them. And so there's all these various different ways that personhood and the human body and all these ideas, what it means to be in the world, they're spread out throughout the entire landscape. So in very, very subtle ways. Anyway, so that's going to bring me to an end. So thank you very much. Thank you one and all. And I would also like to dedicate my research in this talk to Henry Arufie, who passed away sadly only a few weeks ago. Hugely important figure in my life, as he was for many people at the museum and all throughout New Guinea. So we miss him dearly. So anyway, thank you for listening to my ramble. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?